Imagine a grand unknown continent at the bottom of the world. For centuries, mapmakers drew it in lush detail. Even though it didn't exist, Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, was a cartographic legend. It started as a theory, gained a life of its own on maps, and sent explorers on wild goose chases. In this episode, we trace the myth from ancient philosophers to real Antarctic ice, and see how a fable of geography shaped real history. The story begins with a simple idea. The Earth should balance itself. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle speculated that if there was a big land in the north, there must be a matching one in the south. He said something like, for every known continent up north, there must be a counterpart. Medieval scholars picked up on this. The Roman writer Cicero even used the term Singulus Australis, or southern belt, when musing about land beyond the equator. By the 2nd century AD, the great geographer Ptolemy codified these notions in maps. He sketched the world with the Indian Ocean almost fenced in by continents, and left open the idea that there could be more land enclosing it in the far south. In effect, Ptolemy's world map suggested a huge continent under the Indian Ocean. Aristotle's philosophy and Ptolemy's maps planted the seed. Scholars and cartographers began to label empty southern spaces as Terra Australis, the southern land. During the Middle Ages, most educated people simply assumed the southern land existed. In fact, medieval books often referred to Terra Australis by calling it the Antipodes, the lands on the opposite side of the world. Isidore of Seville's influential Etymologiae, 7th century, helped spread the idea. By the 12th century, the concept of a balancing continent was so accepted that it appeared on mappamundi, world maps. Though people debated whether it was habitable, they had no evidence. But they trusted reasoned symmetry over lack of data. When Renaissance mapmakers got better information about Africa and Asia, the edges of Terra Australis started to shift. In the early 1500s, German globemaker Johannes Schoner and later French cartographer Orance Fine sketched an enormous southern land on globes and maps. Fine's famous 1531 heart-shaped map labels a big lump under the Indian Ocean, marking it Brazil or Terra Australis, Recenter Inventa, recently discovered. Likewise, Mercator's and Ortelius's 16th century maps still showed Terra Australis spanning much of the southern hemisphere. In France, the Dieppe mapmakers imagined Have la Grande, a huge southern continent that looks suspiciously like Australia, extending off the coast of Asia. In short, mapmakers filled in the blank areas with whatever made sense to them. If explorers reported an island or coast to the south, cartographers often assumed it hooked up to Terra Australis. Java, New Guinea, even Tierra del Fuego and the northern shores of Australia were all at times depicted as peninsulas or bays of the phantom continent. Thus, medieval and early modern maps made Terra Australis look quite real, until explorers started to probe those regions for real. In the age of discovery, each new Pacific voyage both challenged and fueled the myth. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, 1519-1522, first cut through the stormy strait at the tip of South America. He proved the Pacific was open, not a closed sea, but European mapmakers still clung to Terra Australis. In fact, after Magellan's voyage, some cartographers drew his path as evidence of Terra Australis. They even called the hypothetical continent Magellanica in his honor, thinking he had skirted its northern edge. On maps, the waters beyond Cape Horn were labeled Mare Magellanicum, as if hinting at land on the other side. The myth was adapting itself. Magellan didn't find the continent, but some began to see his discoveries as proof it was just out of sight. Next came the Spanish and Portuguese, desperate to expand their empires. Portugal's Pedro Álvares Cabral and Spain's Álvaro de Mendana launched Pacific expeditions. But the real push for Terra Australis came with Pedro Fernandes de Quiros in 1605-1606. A Portuguese-born pilot sailing for Spain, Quiros was obsessed with finding the southern continent. He convinced King Philip III, with a papal blessing, to send an expedition to discover the southern continent and win souls for the crown of Spain. Quiros sailed deep into the South Pacific, and in May 1606 his fleet entered a huge tropical bay in modern Vanuatu. He was convinced this was part of Terra Australis and grandly named it Australia del Espiritu Santo. He even claimed to have landed on the Great Southern Land. In reality, Quiros had found islands, not a continent. Strong winds blew his ship off, and the flotilla got separated. Quiros limped back to Peru, then Spain, desperately trying to rally support to return. He spent the rest of his life pleading to lead a colonizing mission for God and King, but never returned. Meanwhile, the Dutch East India Company commissioned Abel Janszoon Tasman, 1642-1644, with explicit orders to search for the southern continent. Tasman's two famous voyages found no tropical paradise, but they did chart new lands. In 1642, he sailed under what is now Australia, and sighted the island he named Van Diemen's Land, today's Tasmania. He then discovered New Zealand, again hoping it was Terra Australis, and named it Staten Land, thinking it might connect to Staten Land south of Tierra del Fuego. On his return, Tasman also mapped part of Australia's northern coast on his second voyage, 1644. Tasman essentially proved there was no huge continent just south of Australia, yet the Dutch reports simply contracted the unknown mass on maps. The once mighty Terra Australis was shrunken smaller but still hanging on as unknown coastline. To recap, Magellan, Quiros and Tasman, each in their way, chipped at the edges of the myth, sailing farther and farther south, but each discovery was folded back into Terra Australis. By this point, many Europeans wanted Terra Australis to be real. They'd sent ships, raised flags, even sold investors on it, so they would not easily admit defeat. By the 17th century, maps of the southern hemisphere varied wildly. Some showed Terra Australis as a ring around the pole, others saw it as two separate land masses, but nearly all kept drawing something in the south. Famous map makers stubbornly clung to Aristotle's counterweight theory. Gerardus Mercator insisted in 1569 that such a land must exist to keep the earth balanced, and even Alexander Dalrymple, an 18th century geographer, argued the same thing. Dalrymple, by the way, was one of the Royal Society members who later convinced Cook to chase the Phantom. In fact, during the 17th and 18th centuries, Terra Australis continued to change shape and size, often having no distinct shorelines, as European exploration of the Pacific advanced. In other words, it became a shapeshifter. One decade it included Tasmania, the next, Tasmania was its tip sticking out of a bigger Antarctica. The next voyage cut off another slice. For example, after 1616, when the Dutch sailors Willem Schouten and Jacob Lemaire doubled Cape Horn, maps pushed the southern land even further toward the pole. Bishop Joseph Hall even satirized these maps in 1607, drawing Terra Australis as provinces named Eat Alia and Drink Alia, get the joke, implying that many took it for granted. In the 1770s, the Age of Enlightenment brought a more systematic search. The British Admiralty and Royal Society finally said, "Enough theorizing, let's send ships down there." Captain James Cook got the job. His first voyage, 1768-1771, circled New Zealand and mapped Australia's east coast. Cook himself circumnavigated New Zealand, proving it was not attached to any southern continent. So in 1772-1775, the expedition's second voyage was explicitly to find Terra Australis. They sailed Resolution and Adventure toward Antarctica. In January 1773, Cook's ship became the first to cross the Antarctic Circle. They logged icebergs, sea ice, and saw nothing but open water beyond. Cook famously recorded chart after chart of nothing but ice. When Cook returned home, the conclusion was plain. Terra Australis was a myth. Cook's verdict was the death blow to the legend. By the end of the 18th century, no reputable mapmaker drew a lush southern continent anymore. With Terra Australis debunked in temperate zones, only the polar regions remained unknown. And indeed, by the 19th century, European sealers and explorers finally caught brief glimpses of an icy coast. In January 1820, the expedition of Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, and nearly simultaneously Edward Bransfield and Nathaniel Palmer, became the first to sight the Antarctic mainland. They saw vast ice cliffs, not the green forests once dreamed of. It would be misleading to call Antarctica Terra Australis. It's colder than anyone imagined. Classical theory had assumed a warm, habitable land to balance the Earth. Instead, Antarctica was an icy polar desert. There were no native peoples, no spices or gold, just penguins and pinnacles of ice. Indeed, in 1814, when Antarctica was still unseen, Matthew Flinders persuaded the British to rename New Holland as Australia, drawing from the Latin for southern. Only in 1890 did the name Antarctica, meaning opposite the Arctic, officially arrive for the icebound continent. So reality versus myth. Terra Australis, as drawn on 16th century maps, was a warm paradise. Antarctica, as discovered, is anything but. What did it matter that a continent never existed? Quite a lot, actually. The myth of Terra Australis drove explorers around the globe. Empires poured resources into chasing it. In effect, a false map led to many true discoveries. Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, New Zealand, Fiji, and hundreds of Pacific islands became known because navigators were probing the south. The myth also influenced science. Debates at the Royal Society and in universities over whether lands could exist at the poles led to improved navigation and cartography. The hunt for Terra Australis even spurred technological advances like better chronometers, since charting the southern seas required precise longitude. So what does this saga tell us? For one thing, it reminds us that humans often believe what they want to believe. Ancient logic said north had to have a south, so people saw one. Maps affirmed it, explorers funded it, generations expected it. Yet all it took was actual travel to show it was a mirage. At the same time, the story is proof of how curiosity drives us forward. If not for the Terra Australis myth, would Cook have risked the ice in 1773? Would Tasman have circled New Holland? Would Quiros have sailed into the Pacific? In other words, the map lied, but it was a benevolent liar. It pointed explorers toward new horizons. Maps, like stories, shape our journey. The legend of the Great Southern Continent shows how myths can become missions. In the end, the truth lay under the ice. Antarctica, not the paradise of Terra Australis. But that doesn't make the southern continent any less important to our history. It stands as a monument to human curiosity, a reminder that sometimes the most enduring discoveries come from chasing the continents that aren't really there. Remember to subscribe for more.